Well, ladies and gentlemen, our next speaker is Honorable Member of Parliament, Professor Rajeeva Wijesinghe. In the next few minutes, he will share his views on reconciliation. Let me introduce him before he comes to the podium. Honorable Professor Rajeeva Wijesinghe is a former Senior Professor of Languages of Sabaragamu University and leader of the Liberal Party of Sri Lanka. He coordinated the pre-university English language training program for the University Grants Commission from 1993 to 1998. And as advisor to the Ministry of Education, he was responsible for the reintroduction of the option of English as a medium of instruction in schools. That was in year 2001. He was also chair of the Academic Affairs Board of the National Institute of Education from 2004, which saw an overhaul of school and training college syllabuses. In the year 2007, Honorable President Mahinda Rajapaksa appointed him Secretary General of the Sri Lankan Government Secretariat for coordinating the peace process, which was popularly known as SCOP. And having become a Member of Parliament as a Liberal on the national list of the United People's Freedom Alliance in year 2010, a year later he was appointed advisor on reconciliation to the President. He also currently convenes the task force of the Interministerial Committee to expedite implementation of the National Human Rights Action Plan. He has a number of publications to his credit, and the latest being Declining Sri Lanka and Political Principles and Their Practice in Sri Lanka, Bridging Connections, an anthology of English, Sinhala and Tamil short stories from Sri Lanka, and the Liberal Party of Sri Lanka, History, Philosophy, Presentation, that is 75 years of social change and political flux. With that background, we will now have Honorable Professor Rajeeva Wijesinghe to enlighten the audience on reconciliation.
Thank you, Honorable MP, secretaries, and friends. I should start by saying that though I would have made an appalling officer, I feel a certain affinity with the armed forces for reasons that I hope will be clear at the end of this speech. However, there's another reason I feel a certain kinship, because on account of the great efficiency of the armed forces in May 2009, just as they had to find a new role for themselves, I too had to do the same. They were lucky enough to continue in uniform, but the Peace Secretariat was closed down, and I spent the next couple of years trying to find useful things to do. Becoming an MP has not entirely fulfilled that purpose, so I've taken up a new career as a photographer, and I will inflict that on you through this series of pictures that will accompany my presentation, which I hope will be perhaps more illuminating than what I say. And those of you who have got speech fatigue, which I believe is more dangerous than battle fatigue, could console themselves by looking at this. I hasten to add that I think the most telling photographs were not by me but by my office. They deal with rehabilitation and the displaced in Manic Farm, and that was taken in May and June and July 2009. But all the rest, all the pretty pictures of Sri Lanka, are part of my attempt to find a new job at some stage. But having said that, I will start with a paradox. The title of my presentation is Reconciliation: How the Armed Forces Can Do More and Why They Should. And this might seem a paradox in the current context. I believe that more must be done by the armed forces, but I know that a great fuss is now being made about the role of the armed force in the North. And though I can understand opposition to what might be termed militarization, which must be avoided, I sometimes feel that the formulaic approach of those concerned and opposed to the work of the armed forces is calculated almost to prevent reconciliation. Nowhere was this more obvious than in the almost hysterical approach to the rehabilitation program conducted by government. Vice trenchant but honourable critics of government, such as the TNA Nationalist member, Mr. Sumantharan, have gone on record as praising the rehabilitation program. The diehards in the international community were adamant that there should be no support for the process, and even the UN country team, which used generally to understand the need to work with government, whilst continuing to remind us of obligations, as far as its senior leadership was concerned, it seems later to have tried to prevent any of its members even entering into the centres where rehabilitation was being conducted. Thankfully, the International Organization for Migration has made of sterner stuff and worked effectively with the Commissioner General of Rehabilitation, whilst always giving the CGR and his team credit for their achievements and acknowledging the need for programs to be driven by the government. But the contrast between them and others was so marked that I sometimes wondered whether those extreme elements in the international community who have made much of the running for the last couple of years were not deliberately trying to provide a rationale for the oft-proclaimed criticism of the LTT-oriented diaspora that the former combatants were held incommunicado, which was simply not true. IOM then and the ICRC provide a healthy contrast even to the United Nations team. ICRC, according to WikiLeaks, made it clear to the Americans in Geneva, though I must confess I thought it against the norms usually scrupulously observed by the ICRC to engage in private conversations with another country about matters on which it worked in terms of its relationship only to parties to conflict, that they had recorded most of those who had surrendered. But I suspect one should not worry about deviousness, despite what inductive reason seems to indicate, since prejudice too provides an explanation. I recall one of the most sensible High Commissioners here criticizing the appointment of a military man as Commissioner General of Rehabilitation 3 years ago. I explained to her that we wanted results and that we owed it to the former combatants to proceed swiftly with rehabilitation and reintegration, which had not been moving under the previous civilian CGR. The plan our ministry had prepared with heartening support for the ILO was not being taken forward. And ultimately the reintegration components were not systematically implemented. General Ratnayaka, when he was appointed CGR, and then his successors, all military men, did a wonderful job of the rehabilitation program, and this has been widely recognized. I have dwelt on this at some length because it exemplifies what we should be doing to promote reconciliation, as well as highlighting the insidious impact of its enemies. The Bureau of the CGR, whilst run with military efficiency and the moving sympathy for those in one's care that all those in a military chain of command must evince practically, was under civilian control. It reported to a minister, and both the minister at the time it began its work, and then the remarkably idealistic Dew Gunasekara who took over, ensured that those conducting the rehabilitation programs were fully aware of the nation's obligations to those who were more likely to have been victims of LTT tyranny than supporters of separatism. But as Mr. Sumantharan also observed, and as many of us have been pointing out, the business of reintegration has not proceeded as smoothly as rehabilitation did. The reason is that there is no clear responsibility of this, while monitoring of those who have gone back home and ensuring support for them to resume productive livelihoods has been done by different agencies and authorities. There seems to have been inadequate planning for this difficult task, and implementation is haphazard. For instance, more than a year ago I tried to use some of my decentralized budget, and the commercial bank pledged a matching figure to set up a microcredit scheme, but this was delayed for months. But subsequently, the government decided to set aside a healthy sum to provide credit. But implementation of this has not been systematic, though it's going very well in certain areas, as would have happened had the Commissioner General been entrusted with the task. My argument then is that whilst ensuring civilian controls and responsibility, we must make greater use of the military with its capacity to plan clear-sightedly and carry out operations through a coherent chain of command. In the case of reintegration, whilst the responsibility could be given to the Rehabilitation Authority, which also functions under the Ministry of Rehabilitation and Prison Reforms, the Bureau of the CGR could be combined with that authority to act as its implementing arm, given its great efficiency, for work with former combatants. Sadly, some of the enemies of reconciliation have tried to prevent government implementing programs of support for the former combatants once they have gone back to their homes. They argue that government should not be monitoring those who have been resettled, which ignores the fundamental responsibility to ensure that livelihood activities can be resumed. This cannot be done if there is no monitoring mechanism, but dogma sometimes trumps common sense, perhaps because the primacy of such dogma will limit support for reintegration and thus contribute to further conflict. Conversely, there seems sometimes an effort to deny all credit for the resettlement program to government, despite the massive amount spent by government for the purpose, and instead to claim international responsibility. Interestingly, the donors who have contributed the most for resettlement, the Indian and the Japanese governments, are not part of this insidious effort to cut the government out of the equation. Sometimes I suspect this has to do with cultural factors, an Asian tendency to modesty, where others feel obliged to claim credit, whatever credit is available. I should note that part of the blame for the success in some quarters of the propaganda exercise lies with government, which has not made clear the magnitude of its own contribution. Whilst reports of activity on the large scale are available, as indeed you have seen, these would not be as effective as a breakdown by divisional secretariats, noting how much the government has contributed to resettlement and to livelihood development, through the provision of utilities and services, and enabling the resumption of agriculture through irrigation, the supply of materials, and much else. In this process, the contribution of the armed forces, both in demining and in repair work, should also be recorded. I should note in this regard that in the Vanni, the population in general are full of gratitude to the forces for assistance in activities ranging from rebuilding covils and orphanages to support with transport in emergencies. Some of these, the orphanages, the covils, are illustrated in these pictures. But the running seems to be made by the more political conscious in the Jaffna Peninsula, who had less need of basic services. Whilst I have argued that the approach in Jaffna should have been different, with more consultation and rapid responses to social needs, the failure to record systematically what has been done and use this as a tool for targeting further assistance has contributed to the adverse propaganda against both forces and government. So what more can be done, not only to advance reconciliation, but to make it clear that this is a government-driven process? And thus, I should add, overcoming the cavilling that seems designed, at least on the part of the LTT diaspora, to fuel resentment and thus engender further conflict. That, by the way, is Manic Farm at the very beginning of the housing of the displaced. And I was astonished that people asked me, have you done that for nursery children? And I said, that's what Sri Lanka does for all its nursery children. Uniforms, books, and we treated them all as best possible. That, by the way, is one of the former combatants, and as you can see, she's drying a love heart, which I think shows what those young people needed, rather than being forced into combat. This was in about June 2009. In answering the question, I shall draw upon the input of some of the officers sent to my Office of Reconciliation for discussions on the subject by the Ministry of Defence. Sadly, the Minister of External Affairs, which I had also invited, did not send anyone. doubtless because they have more important concerns than liaising with bodies within Sri Lanka. It was suggested by the many military officials who attended and who contributed in an intelligent fashion that I find lacking in so many of our, I think an organized fashion that I find lacking in other areas. They suggested, as a contribution to the reconciliation process as well as national leads, that the security forces personnel could be utilized in the fields of education, sports, medicine, transportation, entertainment, agriculture, and training. An important rationale for this that was advanced was that the military can work under difficult circumstances and also build up teams. Ideas advanced were as follows. Education and training at the simplest level, this could include basic support, our use of the volunteer officers who were enlisted as teachers to teach English for rural schools, use of physical training instructors to educate school children on games and sports, improve leadership training in schools, which could also extend to youth clubs, introduce and train cadets for Army, Navy, Air Force and police in schools, and support the establishment of scout and guide troops in schools, because one really sad factor is that in many areas in rural Sri Lanka, not only in the north, there is absolutely no commitment to the extracurricular activities that will develop socialization and leadership. These are confined to urban schools. And we have got no mechanism to ensure that children in schools learn to work together with each other. And this is an area in which the forces can provide tremendous leadership. At more advanced levels, forces personnel could establish vocational training centers for youth in coordination with GAs and introduce diploma and certificate programs through the Kotalawala Defence University, working together with other universities if required. Courses that would be useful to the nation while promoting integration could include diploma in languages and translations, expertise in 2 languages plus speaking skills in the 3rd, a diploma in nursing and disability support, a diploma in environmental awareness and sustainable agriculture, diploma in maths and computing, certificates in motor mechanics and electrical engineering with computing and English to enhance employment prospects, and certificates in physiotherapy and physical training. The above courses could be conducted for youngsters from the north together with servicemen whom we must obviously equip for future productive employment as they leave the forces. In sports, we could organize coaching camps for various sports, tournaments, cricket, volleyball, football, in coordination with sports officers and AG officers, with service personnel in areas playing together with civilians against combined teams from other areas, and organize, as is happening, friendly matches with schools and sports clubs in Colombo. Medical, allow the civilians to use the military medical centers, organize medical camps in rural areas. Some of this is happening in various areas, of course. Organize donations of artificial limbs and wheelchairs. Transportation, support private bus services to introduce a school bus system for rural areas, and transportation of patients by military ambulances, which again is happening very often in areas of distance from town centers. Entertainment, organize Tamil musical shows in collaboration with government agencies, organize Tamil films to be shown outdoors, and more recently we have been suggesting the establishment of cultural centers in schools, because I have to say that in the Divisional Reconciliation Committees we have one of the main problems I am confronted with is alcoholism, not the things that are popular put forward. The women come in and say, can we do something to reduce this? And I think one of the factors that we have to recognize in some of those areas is that nothing to do. So when prosperity returns and agriculture leads to funding, the taverns have also expanded. And I think this is something we need to address very seriously. I know it sounds a triviality, but it is one of the biggest problems of domestic violence. And these are the areas where we should be concentrating on using the advantages and the organizational skills of the military to build up support systems for the people. Agriculture. Coordinate agricultural expertise to educate farmers, provision of seeds in coordination with the Agriculture Department, provision of water and water pumps, support to clear and prepare lands for agriculture.